let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
We haven't
This is so
we
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big
employee
piece
What
of
is that process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hello and welcome. I don't know what just happened there, Johnny. Did your screen blip for you too? I don't know.
No, mine seemed
Anyways,
okay.
hello and welcome to this week's Ask an OpenShift Admin office hours. Sorry for me getting off to an awkward start. Apparently, my browser's just not going to behave today. So, that can make things entertaining. So, hello everyone. So this is an office hours live stream here on Red Hat live streaming, which means that Johnny and I are here to answer your questions about anything and everything OpenShift related. So I am Andrew Sullivan. I am co-host of the Ask an OpenShift Admin live stream, and I am joined, as always, by the amazing and wonderful Mr. Johnny Rickard. How are you, sir?
I'm very good, man. Thank you for that. That means a lot for coming from you. I appreciate that. So I needed that today.
Wait. Let's see if this thing works even while we're on the stream. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
afraid of doing hands. What the?
Yeah, my Mac OS upgraded. So here, look.
No, oh, that is so awesome.
Wow.
I've been having way too much fun with this. Here we can do this one. So yeah, if you've upgraded to the newest Mac OS, Sonoma, then yeah, it's built into the OS. You got to go in and turn it off, and it works. Apparently, it works everywhere that the web camera works. So I've been having way too much fun.
That is so awesome.
Well, wonders never cease.
Wow, I gotta be careful because I throw up all my street signs when I'm I'm not sure. Like, all right, peace out.
Or here you can do the so you got double thumbs up. Get you fireworks.
God, that's so awesome.
Yeah. Or here, wait, double thumbs down. Gives you a storm. Yeah. It's way too much fun. Way too much fun.
That's good.
Anyways, enough of me distracting us. So today's topic is the first in our security series leading up to KubeCon here. What is it? The end of October, beginning of November? I don't remember when it is.
Yep.
So we are joined today by Mr. Chris Porter, who is a part of the Advanced Cluster Security team. As far as I know, I don't think you've moved around, Chris. And we'll be talking to us about vulnerability management today. So, Chris, how are you? And welcome.
Great, thank you. Yeah, feeling good. Love talking about this topic. So it's a little weird, but this is my favorite topic, and I do discuss it whenever I get the chance. So thank you for the opportunity today. I've been working with the ACS product for a few years now. It was part of an acquisition, and I was part of the company that Red Hat acquired. So StackRock's veteran from starting back in 2018. Prior to that, I've been working in cloud security and cloud migration. So I've been in and around the security space for most of my career, the last 22 years or so. Thank you.
Very cool. We're happy to have you. Happy to have all of that experience here because security is one of those areas where, Johnny, you've heard me say before, OpenShift and Kubernetes are like a fractal, right? Mm-hmm. Every time you answer a question, the answer leads to a whole nother set of questions that are just infinitely repeating, right? Security is kind of the same, and it's changing so rapidly that, it's just super hard to keep up with.
Yeah. You're chasing gaps everywhere, and adoption of new platforms and new technologies like cloud and AI are enabling incredible new business opportunities. And it often feels like security is an afterthought whenever we have this amazing new leap. Thoughts about how to secure this, how to demonstrate that you have those controls in place, how to to investigate an issue and understand if you've had a breach. Like, all those techniques and tools always seem to come after the fact. I mean, that means that there's forever this this tail chasing that goes on in the security industry, and you always see a lot of startups in that space addressing the gaps that are perceived in a new platform. And cloud is certainly one of those. And AI has already got quite a few folks thinking about data privacy and security, and can AI turbocharge some of these attack techniques that are out there. So plenty of
Yeah.
things to keep you up at night if you're inclined to worry about that stuff.
Well, if it can turbocharge the attacks, it can turbocharge the defense too, right?
That's right. That's
At,
right.
at,
So
at what point
crisis
does
and
it?
opportunity, right?
Well, at what point does it turn into AIs just fighting with each other?
Well,
Like Mortal
today I think
Kombat.
a lot of that's already going on. There's these, there's a more or less an undeclared war that's happening, right, between malware groups and ransomware groups, nation states, and all of us out there. So it goes on continually. But
Yeah.
today I want to carve out a little piece of it and talk about something practical that many of your audience probably has a headache dealing with, day in and day out. We can't tackle everything today. I'd love to, but we don't have that much time.
Yeah, we don't have infinite time.
Right.
So thank you, Chris. We'll dive into more of that here in just a few minutes. I think we've only got a couple of top of mind things today. Not the least of which, as our Hope 9 said, unfortunately, the gestures and Mac OS won't be coming to Kubernetes or OpenShift anytime soon, as far as I know. So top of mind topics. What have you got, Johnny? I lost my tab.
Yep. So the first one is that we've got the what's new for OpenShift coming October 12th. So it's October 12th at 10 a.m. Eastern. So be ready for that. Again, Andrew and I will be on supporting, answering questions that you guys might have. And then it looks like you posted a link to the call for proposals for Red Hat Summit 2024 is open.
Yeah,
And
I
so
was gonna share that one. Just for
you got it.
anyone who's curious. Sorry, go ahead, Johnny.
No, I was gonna say if you got it, like I'll leave it alone. There you go.
Yeah, so if you if you go to redhat.com/summit, as all this link is, so oops, if I could type. So redhat.com/summit, you end up at the landing page. So they just today opened up the call for papers for Red Hat Summit next year. You notice it is early May out in Denver, Colorado. So I, for one, am super happy to see a different city on the list of them. Normally it's Boston, Las Vegas, and San Francisco are the major conference cities, and I like each of those cities. I'm a little burnt out on them, if I'm being honest. So, anyways, the CFP landing page here has a lot of great information about topics that you can submit, the different types of sessions, all that other stuff. I can tell you, here's the CFP guide. So I can tell you that over the last several years, the people who are responsible for selecting sessions, I've been a member of those committees and probably will be again. We tend to heavily favor customer-based sessions. So if you're doing something that you think the world would be interested in, that is really cool, really interesting, submit it. I think we'd love to see it, love to have it. And it'd be great to have more of our customers presenting sessions as opposed to just Red Hatters. We listen to ourselves all the time.
Yeah.
Let's see. So yeah, anyways, pretty straightforward. This presentation, and you saw how I linked there, has all of the different information that you'll need, speakers, the different types of sessions, all the different logistics that you would happen to need. If anybody, I always recommend, so there's a whole thing in marketing, because I have marketing in my title about, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them type of thing. I always take that approach when I do session abstracts. So it's very much, hey, in this session, we're going to learn about blah, blah, blah. And, after the session is done, you should have known, or you should know, or be able to take away from this session type of thing in my submissions. And I feel like it's helped me over the years, but if anybody wants help, tips, anything like that, feel free to reach out. So
Nice.
Tamil, it's good to have you here. Happy to hear that you are enjoying learning about Red Hat and OpenShift from us. Same for you, Eric. And our Hope 9, I saw you up there as well. It's always nice to see you. We appreciate you joining regularly.
Always. Yes, my man.
All right, let's stop sharing that because I don't have anything else to share at the moment. But yeah, I definitely wanted to point out that that is there, and we will post a link to that. Where'd it go? Here we go. I'll post a link to that here in chat. So don't be afraid to schedule something. And if public speaking is not your thing, I get it. It's a skill that we all acquire. That's okay. Everybody, I will say, in all of the public speaking I have done, I have never had someone who's just like offensive or mean or anything like that, right? Everyone is accommodating and understanding, and they want to hear what you have to say. Also
Yeah.
important is nobody knows that you messed up unless you tell them. So
Right.
you can kind of say whatever you want, and like, how's the audience going to know?
And everybody already assumes that you're nervous, so like you don't have to worry about that either.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Anyways, I think that was all we had, right, Johnny?
Just if you want to, do you want to go over the schedule since we got it coming up? Like it's
Yeah, let's do that.
okay. So yeah, so Chris is tribute for the first two sessions of the security series. So this week it's vulnerability management. Next week it's security configuration management. And then the week after it's runtime security with Mike Foster. And then we have the securing CI/CD pipelines with Jafar Sharabi. So action-packed month, all security centric. I think that like this is going to be like a security cake, right? We're building like just layers of the security cake kind of going up, leading into KubeCon. So it's where all the, some of the cool stuff is coming out, and like some of the cool demos and discussions are going to be out there. That's it for top of mind.
All right. Sorry, I'm looking. I apparently forgot to set Do Not Disturb on my laptop, so I'm getting a barrage of emails. Good to see you, Mr. Lauterbach. Trial run of Summit session, a local Red Hat user group is a good way to get comfortable. Yes, it is. So the Red Hat user groups are scattered all over. Definitely recommend that you check those out. I think I'm supposed to do one here in Raleigh in early November. I want to say it's like the first full week of November. I should probably check on that since, I'm supposed to be there and present and do some other things, right? But I got time. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Day of, like, oh God.
I won't say I've never done that before, but it might have happened once or twice. Anyways,
Right.
so Chris, let's talk about vulnerability management. So I try and take the approach here, as we said sort of at the start, security is a huge topic. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of change constantly going on. So I kind of want to level set and talk about, like, when we talk about vulnerability management, what are we talking of, right? We're not just necessarily talking about only applying an operating system patch or something like that, but there's a lot of other aspects, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, vulnerabilities refer to a pretty broad range of conditions. They're generally defined as a bug in software or even hardware or processes. But to box it in a little bit, we're talking about a bug in software that gives someone somewhat unauthorized level of access. It either allows an outsider who has no access to gain access to a system. It could allow someone who has ordinary access to some sort of privileged level. Some of these bugs also allow an outsider to trigger, let's say, a denial of service condition or corruption of data, right? Where they may not be able to gain access, but they can cause damage. And in general, what we're talking about here are the kinds of vulnerabilities that are investigated by, for example, Red Hat Product Security and published in the National Vulnerability Database. And so vulnerability management is something that you have to do for your virtual machines and bare metal servers. But in this context today, we're talking about container images, which have some pretty important differences to vulnerabilities in a traditional server world, because containers are not servers, although they might feel a little like little virtual machines. They're not, and the way that we build them and update them and patch them is very different. So the challenges here are a little bit different. It's also a different order of magnitude because when we talk about migrating an application or building an application for Kubernetes, we typically think about microservices, which means this dramatic expansion in the number of moving parts. And so you might have 10 times as many container images or 100 times as many container images as you ever had servers or server images. So we're talking about both a different subject matter as well as a different magnitude of the problem here. In general, the topic comes up so often because it is what I like to call a foundational control, right? You've got to do vulnerability management because
Mhm.
one, it's a pretty common source of breaches, right? A breach initiates an unpatched vulnerability. We've all heard this story. We can cite examples out there where a fix has existed, but it's not applied correctly because the organization didn't know about that system or doesn't have a mature process for identifying need for patching. So it's a big source of breaches. The other is that vulnerability management is often a mandate in a lot of compliance standards. So if your customers are federal government agencies in the US or elsewhere, if you're in certain industries, you're going to have to demonstrate that you're doing this correctly. There are new mandates from the US federal government, for example, that are going to trickle down. And anybody who's doing any kind of business with the federal government or doing business with companies that are doing business with the federal government is going to find themselves mandated to show that they have some sort of vulnerability management process in place. Something where you'll typically see it as part of the kind of evidence you have to present to an auditor. You have to show that not only that you have the ability to investigate and fix a vulnerability, but you have a process for that, so that new vulnerabilities that are discovered every single day are going to go through that process, get triaged, get fixed, and that you can demonstrate that's done across your entire environment. So that's where the challenge comes in. Fixing a vulnerability is not always that hard. Building a process where this gets done, hopefully as automatically as possible is where the challenge is.
Yeah, and I know what is it, when Jafar's on towards the end of the month is when we'll be talking about supply chain and how to incorporate all of that, and try and build, use automation pipelines within OpenShift to keep as much of that, along with ACS, of course, as much of that. I'm going to say not dependent on humans as possible, because humans are, as usual, the weak link there.
That's a fantastic part of the strategy here. So my overall, my quotable quote about vulnerability management: successful vulnerability management, you should do as little as possible, right? You should do as little vulnerability management as possible, because it's painful no matter which way you slice it. So the less you do, the better. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one of the topics is build your container images in a way where the automation can be applied to update packages with every single build, so that you can get a trusted source like Red Hat, which supplies base images. Those base images are tracked for security issues. You can get the information, but more importantly, you can get the updates as Red Hat produces them. And so Jafar is going to cover this topic, but the more that you can get that trusted source that you can update automatically with every single build, the less vulnerability management you're going to have to do, right? That means that you're just not leaving it to a human being to decide. This is just the day in and day out of the product that you're getting these things updated.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm pretty sure I just saw another supply chain attack.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, there's been, yeah.
More NPM is the one I'm looking at.
Yep. So trusted sources, right? So that is a challenge. You can't really even do vulnerability management if you don't know where those packages are coming from. The sources that you're getting them from don't investigate and track the vulnerability data associated with it. You're running blind there, right? This is one of the reasons why Red Hat puts so much effort in product security to track everything that we deliver, and we disclose it openly, right? This is an honest disclosure about impacted Red Hat products, and give you that clear information about where to go for the next for the updated version of it. So that's an important part. Make sure that you trust the sources of that. Now, we can debate all day about the trustworthiness of NPM. Red Hat is as active in this space as a root authority in the CVE program. Red Hat Product Security provides guidance to organizations, right? So we curate a lot of those open source projects ourselves, the upstreams, the analysis of these issues against those things goes on. And we provide that guidance and assistance to others in the marketplace. Now, another principle that fits in with my, you should do as little as possible, is also, a good example with Red Hat. Container images are not virtual machine images, because containers are not virtual machines. Containers typically have a very limited set of functionality, right? They're microservices. As I like to say, containers really should be as boring as possible. They don't need a lot of stuff. They need basically just the minimal amount of software in there to function. If you're running a Java application, it needs the packages in there to support the Java runtime and any libraries that you're linking to. So the relationship to vulnerability management is that if your container image doesn't have these components in it that you don't need, then you don't have to vulnerability manage those. And this is where something like Red Hat's base image, the universal base image, minimal and micro versions have less stuff in them. So these are great because they're smaller, they're faster to pull, they're faster to deploy, faster to build, but also they just come with less stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And less stuff means you don't have to manage this. If you're a developer, building a Java-based application or a Python application, you know, why are you worried about a bug in the bash shell? Why are you worried about a vulnerability in, a network utility that you never use, right? There's other approaches. I know some of my recommendations, like you shouldn't have tools like curl in your container image. Everybody loves curl, great for troubleshooting, but curl has a history of vulnerabilities. It is what we call a component that is useful for attackers, because if I can get your container to execute arbitrary code for me, I'm going to have it execute curl to go download a crypto miner. So
So
not having it in there. Go ahead.
is there a, I think at one end of the spectrum is things like, asking or wanting our development teams to do things like create statically linked binaries that have no external dependencies and stuff like that. Or is it Wasm? I think Wasm is another one that,
Yep.
it packages everything. It used to be microkernels, which I think are still around, but we don't hear about much anymore. Like one of the spectrum is to do something like that, where
Right.
everything is in that one controlled package, oftentimes a single binary, versus having something that is hundreds, if not thousands of packages, although thousands is probably borderline a whole nother operating system. But,
Right.
And having to constantly patch, update, maintain, right? I feel like the more packages you have in there, the more frequently it's going to need to be updated because there's more of them that are being churned every day, that type of stuff. I'm
That's
trying
right.
to figure out what's the balance there. Do we have a suggested, recommended, preferred balance?
Well, some of the things that I'm recommending are a little painful, and you have to decide, how much pain are you willing to endure. So sure, if I build a binary in, let's say, Go, and I compile it statically, I could use a scratch image with literally nothing on it except the
Yeah.
binary, right? The container image becomes nothing but, an ELF executable, but that's painful to get to. And if you're building in Java or Python or whatever, it may not be practical for you to do that. So it's a good question. In general, you can take a standard base image, you can understand the usage of it with tools like ACS. You can understand what's actually being run within that, what processes are actually being started, and you can trim down an image, or you can start with something like the micro or minimal images and add to it the things that you need. I also like to point out that for a lot of folks, they want their container images to have troubleshooting tools, right? I want to shell in, get a terminal, run curl, check something. But you really shouldn't be doing that, especially for a production application, right? You can be relying on things like OC debug to start up a container image that gives you those utilities when you need it, but doesn't make them available in the container image so that an attacker can make use of them. And of course, again, the relationship with the vulnerability management, the trade-off for all this work is that you gain by not having so many packages to update, right?
Yeah.
So we get into really controversial stuff. I think you shouldn't have shells. You shouldn't have user interactive shells in your containers, right? You can get away without having those types of things. That reduces a whole level of functionality, but it means that application or attackers can't make use of that against you. There's other restrictions like that we'll talk about in the security configuration management session. But my point about this is that if they're not there, you don't have to manage them. You don't have to worry about the updates. And when somebody asks you, where are we impacted by this? Like, hey, not here, because we don't have that packages. We don't have those components there.
Yeah.
The other recommendation, of course, is that when you do have them in there, keep them updated. And that's where I really got to stress that you want to use, something like Red Hat UBI, because they're getting updated. You think about NPM and abandonware, you think about, packages that get out of date. You really need to make sure that the security updates are happening. But something else subtle that happens is that end of life stuff stops getting the investigation done. And so you don't know if a CVE is present in a component because no one's doing that investigation for that older version. So
That's an
staying up
interesting
to
point.
date on all these things is really critical.
Yeah. I never thought about that. Of once it becomes abandonware, people stop looking at it and stop, evaluating for those. So a minute ago, you said something interesting, and it's one of those things that I always like to call out or point out about ACS, and that is ACS can in real time, watch, analyze, take action against the containers that are running inside of, the cluster. So, if you define a rule that says, I don't want to ever see, something that is using this package or this process, this executable run, it prevents that from happening before it even starts. And I remember back when it was, Peter made a comment in here about the cool but scary names. I think it was Heartbleed or
Heartbleed, yeah.
Heartbreak. It was one of
Heartbleed.
those where, like, we used to do a demo that was, hey, look, I have this vulnerability inside of a container image, and I've defined a rule in ACS that even if I try and start this thing, it just doesn't. Right? It prevents it. It throws up an error. It sends a log alert and all that other stuff. And I thought that was always a really cool capability.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we designed it that way. It's easy to get started. We when we a couple of years ago now began to identify the log4shell vulnerability. Right, everybody in the world was running around with this, and the product made it really easy to identify that, answer that question, like how are we impacted by this and where. Right, it can also tell you when that log4shell is present in something that is exposed outside of your OpenShift cluster, which means it's potentially available on the network, to an outside attacker. This is a network-based attack that could exploit log4shell. And we continue to bring in the product more of that sort of risk analysis of these things. But I think what goes less well understood is that ACS is there to promote the process that I've been describing, right? Keeping your images to a minimum, making sure they're continually updated and patched. Just simple rules like, hey, I'm not going to let you deploy something where a container image is more than 90 days old, right? That sort of thing, that early feedback in the product I think is the way to go. That helps to build that healthy process. It puts in front of the team that's building these things the understanding of what these rules are, right? The policy is no longer a mystery. And it says, look, this is a critical vulnerability with an available fix, right? Update the component. This is a component that's potentially dangerous to use. Don't include it in your builds. And here's how to remove it. So the goal overall with ACS, whether it's vulnerability management or anything else, is to make it very, very clear to everybody in the organization that there are some rules around, usage of OpenShift, and you have to follow them in order to be admitted to the party. I think in that regard, it's very friendly. But
it's funny you say that, because I was talking with a friend of mine who works for a partner. And he was saying that he sits in engineering meetings, and it seems like, at least once or twice a week, they have engineering level meetings of, oh, well, OpenShift doesn't let us do this thing, so we need to accommodate that. And it's almost always a result of something like SCCs, right? Because we enforce, restrict. Yes, I know. Thank you. I'll do this instead of my normal like this, but SCCs, no root containers, right? The other things that OpenShift enforces, that other Kubernetes is Kubernetes, we'll just make up words. Don't. So it's interesting to me, and like you said, we're enforcing this set of rules of, if you want to run on OpenShift, if you want to utilize OpenShift, not just at the ACS level, but at the platform level, there are certain things that help to, for better or for worse. And I'm sure there are plenty of folks out there who don't appreciate we don't let you just go and do all of these things. You have to remove the safety guards, if you will, and some of them you can't. I haven't seen one in a while, but I used to see about once a quarter, I would see a message on the OpenShift SME mailing list about, can we turn off SE Linux?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, no, you cannot. I'm sorry.
If you want to ride the ride, you got to be this tall, right? That's something that is kind of unfortunate. This is one of the earliest things we thought about, as Kubernetes as a new platform was designed, by engineers, by SREs, right? It's a platform made for running applications, and there's as few barriers as possible. And then security comes along and has a look at that and says, well, we don't have accommodation for all of these basic security precautions. And then, to the credit, the Kubernetes project has certainly advanced a great deal on that. There's been a lot of new additions that enable good process around security, and especially back in 2019, the review of the Kubernetes code base brought out some really surprising things that it was kind of the reason that StackRox existed, was just some of the things are very confusing. It's difficult to expect a developer to know about all of these things, right? To know that running a root in a container is like running root on the host, and that's a dangerous path for container escape. So the protections in OpenShift make a great deal of sense. I think that what ACS does best, right, of all the things that it does, is that it's trying to ease that process for those developers, right? As we like to say, it's the security tool that developers hate least, right? Because not that they're going to love it, because we're making extra work, right? In this world, we have to understand that software engineers have a growing responsibility for the security of the applications that they're building. So there's some extra work here, but it's going to be done in a way that it fails cleanly, it fails fast, with a very understandable
Yeah.
message, right? This is the guidance that you have to meet.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think there's also been, at least my, so Andrew is not a developer, and Andrew has not created software, been responsible for deploying software in a very long time. But it feels like there has been kind of culturally amongst, both developers and IT operations folks, this mindset shift. And it really started with the whole, it's not just DevOps, it's DevSecOps, mantra.
Hmm.
But this mindset shift of the security team is not the enemy. Right? The
right.
security team is there to help. They are there to make things, basically protect the company and protect the organization. And so this mindset shift away from, they're a barrier that we have to clear in order to get to, deployment, to production, to the next release, whatever it happens to be. And rather, let's work alongside them. Let's incorporate them. Let's educate them on why this may or may not be an issue and stuff like that. We've got a number of questions piling up, Jonny. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, real quick, though, I just want to add on to what you're saying, because that's exactly what I was going to say. I think that, like, definitely in the last 5 years, right, we've seen that shift where it's gone from, like, all right, well, I'll just turn this off for now, and then, like, everything that's temporary is permanent. So Peter Lauterbach said, like, every time you run set and force 0, it makes Dan Walsh cry, or weep. I mean, like, that's back in the day, that's what you do. You turn off IP tables, or you turn off, like, set and force 0, stuff like that. But yeah, to your point, like, with all these things happening, it's like, okay, this could very well happen to me. Like, I could get steamrolled by, like Equifax, right? I just forgot to enable something simple, and then boom, I got pwned big time. And I think everybody kind of sees that, and it's like, okay, that's 5 extra minutes, or that might be a half day extra work to code that up. So yeah, let me just go ahead and take care of that now. So, like, the whole shift left thing is, like, it's actually rooted, and yeah, it's nice to see it's at the forefront. And then, do you want to start with the first question on the bottom, or do you want to roll up? Because I think that
Let's start with the oldest, which is Adam. So thoughts on CVSS version 4?
Well, good thing to see this advancing, right? Red Hat's been a part of the CVE program and the CVSS program here. So I like that it is taking into account a little more of the, is this really exploitable, right? So CVSS scoring was, the way that score works, that's the headline. Everybody says, oh, it's a 7.0, it's an 8.0, a 10.0. That's intended to encompass a lot of different attributes, right? About the practicality of the attacks, the potential blast radius of it. And I think the CVSS4 does a very good job with it. So that'll be released shortly. When the challenge is going to be is, when do all of the analysis tools and others start to produce those scores? And I think that's going to be a long tail of adoption for that. So today, within the ACS scanner, we don't use those today, but it's something that will come shortly in the new year. I think that's the plan, at least. And so we'll be waiting, really for those scores to be available. CVSS version 3 took a while to adopt. In fact, CVSS v2 scores are still being produced for a lot of things, and for historical reasons, they're still being preserved. So, it's not going to answer the question for you of, should I fix this or not, right? There's guidance, there's wisdom out there in the world about whether a vulnerability is going to be something that you could ignore, that if it's a practical, if there's a practical exploit available for it. CVSS v4 will give you some more meat to decide that, but you still have to decide on your own policy, right? It's something where every organization is going to have to understand their tolerance for risk. These are all good inputs to those risk models, but it's something that organizations are going to have to decide for themselves what to do with that data once it's produced.
Yeah, I'll admit that I am out of date on the CVSS standards and all of that. So while I was aware of version 4, I have not taken the time to go in and read about and identify the differences. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
What do we got next, Jonny?
The next one's from Pete, and it's every time you run, or oh my God, just read that. Pete was asking what your thoughts on the Red Hat container grades are.
So I think this is phenomenal, right? I came from an outside, originally, and so joined Red Hat and didn't realize that that all the stuff was going on behind the scenes. Kind of a shame. Red Hat does a lot of great work here. I think the fact that Red Hat provides open and honest disclosure about the issues impacting the software that we publish is phenomenal, right? There are bugs, there are vulnerabilities. This happens. There's nothing that could ever be done to avoid this. I suppose you could stick your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist like some organizations do, but Red Hat identifies these issues. In many cases, Red Hat product security is the one identifying the initial issue, right? We identify the misconfiguration or the vulnerability, or they're doing the investigation based on a report from an outsider. When those are disclosed responsibly, Red Hat product security follows a process of investigation and assigning severity and all that. And the fact is, you go to look at the software that's provided by Red Hat, and you can use Red Hat's own data or the convenient website there to understand those issues with it. It is about risk management. It's about understanding that a low severity vulnerability has a very low likelihood of being exploited, or it has a very low impact. If it is exploited, you might decide to go ahead and use that anyway. You might decide to wait for there to be a fix for that. When there's a really, really critical one, right? Some of these things like Log4Shell or Heartbleed or others, people turn to Red Hat for information about that. And that history is where the trust comes from, right? That we're open and honest about it. And I can think of very few other vendors where you could go to their site, look at downloadable software, and see a warning next to it, right? We don't just remove it from the internet because someone might have a build process that depends on a particular tagged image, for example. And just removing it or making it unavailable would break a customer's process. But going there and being able to see that this information is there, I think, is a powerful example of what Red Hat's openness can bring you in terms of security.
So
It's something that customers have come to trust, right? I think it sets a standard for the industry that very few others are able to meet.
agreed. So I guess what is sort of an extension of that is, do we need to take action, care about every one of those things that pop up? Like, so when I think of the container grades, Quay, for example, ACS does the same thing. Will give me an image grade that's a letter, right? Does it make sense organizationally for me to say if it has anything below a B, I'm automatically not going to use that? Or is there more? Do you have to put more thought, more investment into it to figure out, as you were saying, is this something that is exploitable? Is this something that I need to care about, or can I safely ignore it?
That's a good question. So Red Hat ACS rather doesn't look at the container grade to see if that this has a particular letter grade in it. That's an interesting idea. I mean, a lot of it is because we wouldn't be able to tell anyway. If you take, let's say, a UBI and you build on top of it, right? Like, look, you may update it, and even though the UBI version might have a B now in it, the update would have fixed that. Like, there's a lot of complexity in using that. That shortcut letter grade there is only convenient up to a point. What we do have, of course, is the policies to allow you to decide the root information. Now, the reason it got a B grade is because maybe there's an important ranked vulnerability that's in that version that impacts that particular version of it. So in ACS, you have the criteria of looking at important and critical ranked vulnerabilities and stopping a deployment of an image that has that. So we can get there effectively the same thing, but allowing customers to use the commonly available severity, or if they want the CVSS score, the raw scores, to make a decision about whether something can be promoted or not, or whether the development team gets a message that says, "Hey, this image is now impacted by this known vulnerability." So that raw scoring there allows customers to decide what their tolerance for risk is. And generally, most compliance standards require that, like, some level of, like, hey, you have to address everything with this level of criticality within 30 days or within 60 days or whatever it might be. So the policies in ACS allow you, and most tools, to be honest, most vulnerability management tools give you some policy to follow those kinds of standards.
Well, and frankly, it makes you answer for using that software, right? It doesn't allow you, not it, like, but your process as a company, right? They say, hey, I found a B letter container image, but I really need it for this, right? Now you have to go out and justify that to your security team or to your admin team or whatever. And you're like, hey, look, I'm using this image. Here's why. So like when we start scanning, it's going to trigger on this, but you have an answer. And then your security officer can say, well, I accept the risk for that because yes, I understand that we need that component or whatever, and it's a not fixed upstream or whatever. But at least you have an answer, right? You have an understanding of why that's there, not just some rogue package or some rogue container image that's just sitting out in your environment.
That's right. I mean, that's really, really important, John. And I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, security is not effective when it's a simple single rule applied everywhere with no exceptions.
Yeah,
Developers are smart. What they do is they'll work to get around that rule, right? Or the rule will cause, some outage, and then the business blows up, and there is a fight over this, and then the rules get turned off, right? So blanket rules don't help anybody. Where what we need here is a sophisticated process where those exceptions are okay. As long as there is an understanding and there's documentation for that, it's okay to have those exceptions, right? We want the rule to be, hey, fix all the fixable critical stuff, right? The high scoring things that are probably going to bite you. But whereas an exception is needed, the policy, and what you said, the risk acceptance, right, as we call it, where a team is willing to accept the risk of this, they take on ownership of that, and understanding who in the organization is signed off on that. So I like to joke about half of security is sometimes knowing who to blame, but it's really about making, it's about mature adults having an understanding, right? Like to say, hey, this is an internal application that's not exposed anywhere. This is a hard to fix vulnerability. It'll be done as part of, like, let's say, the next major upgrade, but right now it's not as easily fixed. And there's always going to be that trade-off. How much time and money do you spend on this versus the risk of that exploit? Yeah. And the best that we can do as a vendor of both the security tool and the security data that powers that tool is to give our customers as much information as we can about that. And CVSS4 helps to add to that. There's other things that are coming from the future of Red Hat security data that you can read about on some of the blogs to talk about these things, giving our customers the ability to make more, better decisions about risk, and instead of just sticking your head in the sand.
I come from the government with Andrew, like from 100 years ago, and we worked with career no engineers, and so the response was like, how do I get to know as quickly as possible? Like, how do we start at no and stay there? And so like it's nice to see. I think it's like some of that. Some of those folks start to move on. I don't want to like age people out or whatever, but as folks start to move on, and we have like people that understand the technology better in those positions now, right? They understand like, okay, look, I've got to be able to flex a little bit. I've got to be able to see like, okay, it's not just black and white anymore.
Right.
You mentioned like it's not just a on or off, right? It's not a binary decision anymore. There's things that go along with it. So
that's
sorry,
right.
Andrew, I cut you off as you're starting to talk there.
Running applications has risk. I mean, no matter what you do, there's no such thing as zero risk. And most organizations are living with a lot of risk. And, part of the goal at StackRox was to help show, what ACS has become is to show you that there is risk, and that some of that is acceptable. Some of it is acceptable under certain conditions. Some of it is the risk changes as the conditions out there in the world change, right? So I guarantee if you use your ACS dashboard today against your OpenShift clusters and you look at all the deployments that are running something like a bash shell, right? Like the process is actually running, there's probably plenty of them. And today that may not bother you. Tomorrow, maybe the disclosure of an important critical bug in bash, and now suddenly the risk of that has really changed pretty dramatically. And so you're right, it's a range of shades, and you have to decide individually what risk you're willing to live with, because it all has some level of risk. What I think we can do by shining a light on a lot of this stuff is to help that prioritization, right? When there's a critical new vulnerability discovered and your teams need a little bit of time to address it, right? Then understanding that your exposed services are more likely to be attacked. The ones that have sensitive data are going to be the ones that you're really worried about, right? The keys to the kingdom. The deployments that have no restrictions on the network are a place that's likely to result in an attacker getting further in the environment, right, where they leverage that vulnerability for the biggest blast radius. So these are all different risk aspects, and that's a bigger topic that we'll talk about under configuration with ACS. But vulnerability management is a piece of the whole. In fact, you can do better vulnerability management with more of that context. It becomes easier to enforce a rule that says, hey, this easily exploitable remote code vulnerability cannot happen in any exposed service. If you're in a front end, if you're in this cluster, if you're exposing using a route in OpenShift, we are not letting you bring that into this environment. And that means there's actually less impact on the development team. They know to focus on specific apps rather than having to run around and try to fix everything all at once, which people will balk at. So it's about practical security.
So I have a question, and it's tying together a couple of them here, and that's so jumping back a little bit with the container grades. So who was it? Hasif asked about custom policies in addition to the predefined ones, but also rHope9 made an interesting comment here about having regulatory requirements translate to container grades. So can we effectively define policies that it will use to analyze and assign a health, right? Whether that's, red, yellow, green, A, B, C, 60, 70, 80, whatever that happens to be for the, I'll say security of an image.
So I don't know. The regulatory controls that I'm familiar with say things like any vulnerability with a CVSS of 7.0 and above must be addressed within X days, right? You have to have a process for identifying them and correcting them within, 30 days if they're fixable, if there's an upstream fix available. Now, CVSS is not not always the best way to analyze these, but that's often the letter of the law. Many organizations, rightly, are going to want to follow the letter of the law. So the container grades, I don't recall, unfortunately, like how exactly those are determined, but they're determined by something similar to that. If you have what Red Hat calls an important or a critical severity vulnerability in them, then those are going to get the marking of a lower grade for those things. Within ACS, we also distinguish between fixable and not fixable, right? Many vulnerabilities never have a fix because they're too low of an importance. There's some dispute about them. My favorite one is one goes back to 2005, where the vulnerability is supposedly that tar doesn't strip set UID bits from files, and the response is tar is working as designed, right? It's not a vulnerability. This is the tar archive, program working as it's intended to be working. So, those won't show up in the container grade, but they are visible in something like ACS and other scanners because, for full disclosure, right, they are there. So it does make sense. If I were given the chance to update some of these standards, like some of the NIST standards out there for vulnerability management, I would take a more practical approach to this. I would focus on process that fixes vulnerabilities rather than any particular vulnerability being fixed. That you have a process in place that nothing can escape your notice. Every container image is going to get scanned no matter what, right? That they're all updated, that they're all coming from, like bases like UBI, so that that you can get those updates and that a trusted vendor like Red Hat is supplying you the fixes. Some of them like NIST 800 190, the container application standard there, do have process as part of it, right? Like you should take a pipeline-based build approach to your container images. Vulnerability scanning should be a part of that. But most of these standards don't dictate the hows, they just dictate like what the requirement is and what evidence you need to provide. So I don't know that they're going to necessarily map that to something like, like Red Hat's container grade there.
Yeah, and so Steve has a question as well. I want to touch on Fayez's, and apologies for butchering names, comment here. So essentially, if I'm understanding, a lot of hits on our firewall for UDP port 4789 from remote worker nodes to other worker nodes in the cluster. So my initial suspicion is that's probably normal and expected, because if you're using OpenShift SDN, it uses VXLAN. VXLAN uses that port. Clearly don't take my word for it. Make sure you check and analyze and verify all of that information. But the documentation does have, and I don't know if I can, this is a super long link, so I don't think it'll work in YouTube. But yeah, I would check on that. If you blocked it on the firewall, the node will continue to run. As far as I know, it'll be fine. Just those pods wouldn't be able to use the SDN to communicate with other pods in the cluster. If it's a remote worker node, that's probably fine. It is supported to have those remote worker nodes more or less isolated from other nodes on the SDN. That's expected. So Steve asks, does the security scanning engine used by Quay, is it the same as the one used by ACS? I think the answer is, well, it used to be no. I thought we were working towards changing that though.
You're right. So the simple answer is that today, no, they come from a different heritage. They're both based on the Claire upstream project. It's just two different companies, right? Because ACS came in via acquisition. They have a different fork of the same project. Remember, the vulnerability scanner has really, like, you think about it as two things, two major functionality. One is the part that breaks down the container image into the layers and opens the layers to look at the file system. That's in common with the Claire engine everywhere. And then the other part of it is the mapping of the component data that's found within those layers to the vulnerability data. And so there are some differences today. There is a plan to make this a single story for Red Hat. It's just a matter of doing the software engineering to do that. So they will be consistent, and that means they'll have both the same engine breaking down the layers as well as the same data mapping, so that the results would be consistent. So that if Quay says there's a component with a critical vulnerability, ACS will say the same thing. They'll be fed from the same data sources. And those upstream data sources are actually going to be growing over time. Red Hat's changing how that's done and the Red Hat sources. But we also, of course, pull from other sources like NVD, like other distros out there, like language-based vulnerabilities for things like Java and Python and NPM and others. So the consolidated view there will allow the engineering team to focus their efforts on improving all of those capabilities over time. So this is an important project here at Red Hat right now.
Yeah. Well, and to make that even more complicated, Quay itself came from an acquisition too, right? It came from CoreOS. So
Right.
two acquired things that have to, remerge because they both started with Claire and then kind of went like this and coming back.
That's right. Yeah. And we recognize that customers are also using other vulnerability scanners out there with OpenShift and container images. And much of the principles that I described are available if you're using other tools as well. I like ACS, and I think it's the best product for you. But there are other products out there that will do the vulnerability scanning. One of the things that's important if you're using Red Hat products is that the scanning results be accurate for Red Hat products. And one of the things you can look at into is the Red Hat certified program for vulnerability scanners. There are several vendors like ACS Scanner that are certified under the vulnerability scanner program that they're accurately using Red Hat's security data. Not doing that is going to mean that you're going to get those inaccuracies on occasion. You're going to get situations where a given vulnerability might be high scoring in NVD, but because of the way Red Hat builds, let's say packages, and compiles them with security options, and we don't always pull everything from upstream, we may not be impacted. Red Hat version of that component may not be impacted by that. And so it gets marked as a low, and you'll see the conflict there where some vulnerability scanner is screaming about a critical bug in a Red Hat component, but actually Red Hat is saying this is a low priority because the included bug is not part of the code here. So just a note to be careful about. Red Hat established that program for certifying these specifically because of the customer concern about the inaccuracy of some of the tools out there.
Yep. Yeah, I still see those emails come flying by every once in a while of, hey, this Red Hat package is showing up as being a critical vulnerability. When is Red Hat going to patch this? And it turns out, well, we didn't necessarily patch it so much as, like you said, we changed the way it's built, or we have other things that mitigate that, and therefore it's not a critical per se.
That's right. It's one of the advantages of consuming open source software through a trusted source like Red Hat is that we vet that, we understand that, and we're not always, eager to pull in the latest bleeding edge thing out of those upstream projects because of the risk that security problems would be introduced there. So it's definitely something to think about as part of it. I've also seen vulnerability scanners that produce, frankly, just ludicrous results, right? Very difficult. They're matching components, things that you can go dig down into the container image itself and definitely confirm that they're not present, that they seem to find, and vice versa. They tend to miss things. So some of the tools out there are, a little mysterious about how they're arriving at their conclusions.
So that kind of begs the question in my mind of, so how do vulnerability scanners work? Are they, if I pointed out a container image, is it literally just opening up that container image and looking at the files that are in there? Does it have awareness, knowledge of like how they're built or how even the binaries inside of there are built? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, the way Claire works is on a layer basis. So we look at a container, and a container is really, the image is an index of the layers that are it makes up, right? We talk about a base layer. We talk about the commands that get run as part of your container file, and essentially any container file command that changes the file system by adding, removing something, even changing permission on a file results in a new layer. So the Claire breaks those down. The layers are, archives of file systems, and we go through all of those things, typically looking at the metadata from package managers or things like the manifests listed in a Java jar file to find out what's installed. And then the strings for those packages are matched to the data that comes from the CVE program or from, Red Hat Oval data that says this is the version range the version number or version range that's impacted by that. Now, the good thing about that is because the layers never change, right? They have a SHA, they don't change. If you change the image, you're actually getting new layers. So we can cache the results by saying, look, this layer has these components in it. And then all we have to do is update the vulnerabilities as those change over time. So if we know that, OpenSSL 1.0.1F is in this particular layer, that's never going to change. And any images that are using that layer are impacted with the vulnerabilities associated with that component. Now, there's other ways to do it. You could fire up a container runtime and actually start the container and running a parsing process in the container, ignoring the layers and just looking at basically the container file system there. And if you needed other types of introspection, I suppose that's useful, but it's difficult to run in a CI/CD pipeline because now you got to have a container engine like Docker or Cryo or something where you can start that up or go to other techniques, and it's often a more heavyweight approach. ACS obviously using Claire, prefers the approach of actually downloading and crunching the layer data itself.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I would imagine starting the container would have a whole lot of other implications as well. So while it's probably going to be the most accurate representation, it's going to be by far the most complicated, the most difficult. As well as you don't get the reusability aspect. Like you said, the layers don't change. So if I have 100 containers that all start with UBI, I only need to look at UBI once, and then it just reuses that because of the the
That's right.
SHA.
Yeah, running the container represents a few other challenges. You generally need to have the package manager binaries in there, or you need to introduce them in order to be able to read the data on the packages that are installed. And that's one of those things back to my earlier point, right? Like containers don't need package managers. And the package manager software itself is something that you can remove from your container images or not have at all. There's no need for a package manager in a container. In fact, ACS has default policies around this. That's just one more thing that you have to do vulnerability management for, and one more thing that an attacker can go and use against you. So, you use something like UBI Micro doesn't even have a package manager in it, right? So you can build your applications on those, and then the resulting container just doesn't have that stuff in it, so less to manage.
Yeah. Speaking of the Red Hat opinionated way of doing things that sometimes is unexpected or more difficult than expected. How do
Yeah,
I install things to this? Well, you mount it and you add
Well,
things and you do it's
that's right.
it's that way for a reason, like you said, to minimize the footprint, to minimize that surface area that's there, and make sure that you actually intend to do what you are doing and not, you know,
Yeah, and Red Hat has plenty of good examples on how to do that. You can adapt it to your process. The pain is once, right? But
yeah.
then the freedom from all that vulnerability management work is forever, right? That if you just, you're automating this, you're rebuilding, you're getting those packages in that are the latest at the time of the build, and then the resulting container is really compact and has really very few things to maintain in it whatsoever, the less time you'll spend on vulnerability management. So
Hey, Chris, I want to circle back to a question that we got earlier. We asked it, but then I think we we talked over it with something else that kind of came up right after. It's from Hasif, and it is it possible to define custom policies other than the predefined policies in ACS? And if yes, what's the language that's used to develop them? For example, OPA uses Rego.
yeah, so you absolutely can define custom policies. It is not based on a programming language like Rego. You don't have to be a programmer to use these. They are stored in the ACS configuration as JSON objects that are key value pairs. So when you're matching criteria, So you can use the built-in policy engine to drag and drop the criteria. It's intended, honestly, for an InfoSec audience that may not be as familiar with software development and containers and OpenShift. So it's designed to be a nice GUI based way, but you can define them in JSON if you want to upload them. I think the best way to get started with ACS policy is actually to clone one of the default ones that's close to what you need and then modify it yourself. Another kind of unsung feature is that in pages like risk management in the UI, there are search filters. And if you're looking for something like who has this vulnerability, who's running a shell, that search filter is effectively building a policy for you. And indeed, there's a button in there that says create policy. So once you're happy with a search filter, you can create a policy from that search filter that will then match that going on. I think it's a good way to do it because most InfoSec teams start their day, maybe they're looking for evidence of something, they're threat hunting. Hey, we heard about this problem. This is something we need to investigate. And so it's a natural flow from investigating a problem to creating a policy to identify that condition going forward. But yes, absolutely, custom policies are a great thing. I like the fact that as we get good ideas, the product management team for ACS often seeks to build useful policies in by default. So over time, there's more and more default policies added that do cool and interesting things. So if you you have a good idea, let us know, and we'll just get ACS to do it by default.
Nice. Yeah, and Savion, I really apologize if I butchered your name there. So, made a comment about the network graph. So like when the royal you, when ACS implemented the network graph, like where you can go in and create the policies and stuff like that through the UI. Yeah, super dope feature. That is awesome.
Thank you.
And then Juan had I apologize if I messed that up. I feel like I messed that up. ACS needs integration with OCP CIS benchmarks. They won't install the ACS and compliance operator together. So do you have anything like any kind of like retort back to that? Like, hey, well, you could do this without the compliance operator, or this is why you need to add the compliance operator?
So really good question. And so, yeah, ACS really only has support for the CIS benchmark for OpenShift, or for example, the new DISA STIG for OpenShift through the compliance operator. The products are integrated with each other. There are changes coming. In fact, I urge you all to check out the what's next presentation for ACS, where Michael Foster and Kirsten Newcomer discuss where things are going here. There's a lot of work being planned around compliance. So the need is there. We understand that, and we understand that ACS has got a role to play in that compliance part of it. But the compliance operator being a trusted solution for most of our customers. We're not about to remove that either. We're not about to do away with it. So there's good things going on in the future there.
And Chris, I'd be curious to hear your perspective of, there's a lot of overlapping security capabilities, I think, between core OpenShift capabilities operators along with ACS and ACM, and kind of where do you see, or how do you talk about, envision all of those things working together?
That's a great question. And it's something that, the product management team that builds these products understand all of that. I think in some cases there's overlap intentionally, right? Things like regulatory compliance are very complex. You need things, for example, you need compliance operator and ACM to harden your OpenShift clusters and build them to the configuration that meets your standards and make sure that new clusters that are rolled out are meeting that standard, right? So there's a role to play there. At the same time, compliance, like the network graph in ACS, can help you understand the relative isolation of your applications within that OpenShift cluster, right? So, and that's needed for things like PCI and HIPAA that require that you have isolation of sensitive data. So all the products here play a role. Some of the overlap is, partly because they come from different histories, right? And they come from a different approach, different companies over time. And some of those you're seeing in the product's history and in the roadmap too, where you'll see where certain functions are going to drift naturally into different products. I think that when you look at features that are in both OpenShift and ACS, again, I think they're complementary. You mentioned SCCs earlier, and these aren't going to go away, right? SCCs are a critical thing, and prevent you from running a privileged container. And ACS has a policy too for that, but they serve different roles, right? ACS is there to tell you in your pipeline that, hey, you're trying to build a deployment with a privileged pod in it. This is not going to fly, right? The SEC is there to make sure that if you ignore that, you're going to get kicked back, right? So they reinforce each other, and I think that that's going to continue. You're going to see controls in multiple places because we got to provide as much notification and understanding about this as possible to everyone involved. So
Yeah. Yeah, and our Hope 9 made a good point in his comment there of ACS tends to focus on or is really good at what's happening on OpenShift. The network graph, the pods are communicating this way. We can manage network policies. The containers are executing these things or using these libraries, these packages, that type of stuff. Whereas
that's right.
many of the features of OpenShift itself are focused on the platform. And when you look at something like the compliance operator, right, is the platform's configuration in line with whatever that compliance standard happens to be.
That's right.
They do
We
work
refer to-
together.
That's right. Absolutely. We refer to security of the cluster versus security in the cluster. And they do overlap a little bit, right? You can do things like look at the configuration of OpenShift, understand any vulnerabilities in RHEL Core OS through ACS. But you're right, there's that they work together, right? I think that ideally you want to have both of these in every cluster that you're running, because where OpenShift has policies and controls that leave off, ACS is just getting started, right? The configuration and things. So, much of what you can get in ACS, you could do in OpenShift, but ACS gives you that, the little bit of benefit to the developers, the higher level goals, mapping into controls that your organization needs for that. So I think they make a great pair. It was a good combination.
I wholeheartedly agree. So I know we're coming up on our normal end time, which is about 15 minutes after the hour. So for our audience, first, we really appreciate all of the questions, all of the chat that you all have had. You all have heard Jonny and I say it many times. We love all the interactivity. So thank you. If you have anything that you want to ask, please feel free to put that into the chat now. We'll go ahead and do our best to answer those questions while we're here on the stream. If you are not watching us live, please don't hesitate to reach out. So you can reach out to me directly at andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. Where's my little pop-up thing that shows this? Or you can reach out to me on various social media platforms at Practical Andrew. So again, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. It's usually the fastest and easiest way to get a hold of me because I don't go on X or Twitter or whatever it is hardly at all anymore. So there's also the Kubernetes Slack. So if you go to kubernetes.slack.com and then search for the OpenShift users space, or what do they call those there? I can never keep up with these things.
Workspace.
Channel. Yeah. Google is workspaces. Slack is channels.
Yeah.
So if you look for the OpenShift users channel inside of there, you'll find me and Jonny and a whole bunch of other folks inside of there. You can also reach out to Jonny at Jonny, JONNY at redhat.com or JRockTX1. And Jonny, I know you posted a link into, I want to say, the Kubernetes Slack earlier, didn't you?
Yes.
We were posting it all over the place, talking about these things. So yeah, feel free to ask questions after the stream if you're not watching us live. Chris will be back with us next week, so we can certainly follow up with any questions if we need to. And get those taken care of. I like the onion structure. Yep, just like ogres, security comes in layers. I know Shrek. My kids think that I'm old because I quote Shrek on a semi-regular basis, which, to be fair, I am kind of old. So,
But it's a very quotable movie, to be honest. I mean, let's be real.
It is. What's funny is I remember lots of Shrek, the first Shrek, but I don't remember hardly any of the ones after it. So
yeah, same way.
Is ACS next week's topic? Not specifically. So Chris is an ACS, and apologies for talking for you, Chris. Chris is an ACS expert and on the ACS team, but we are kind of talking across the OpenShift portfolio. So as well as just other things that are, I'm going to say, related and important to and being a part of that. So it's not just ACS. And next week we'll be talking about, configuration management for security.
Hey, Chris, do you want to spill the beans on some of what that means?
Sure.
Put you on the spot here.
Yeah, no. So it's a good. I'm happy to do that, and we'll talk a lot about this next week. It's my favorite part of it. It kind of goes unnoticed as much, but the traditional view of security for containers is that the container image is the end all be all of everything, and if we scan our container image for whatever problems, then we're done. And the reality is that the configuration that you supply as part of your deployment in OpenShift has a huge impact on the security of the running containers. And in many ways, you can make container security better than you could in traditional environments by making use of the configurations that are available. So this is something that really makes container security different than traditional security, traditional vulnerability management. And when I go out there and I'll put a stake in the ground and say, migrating in applications to a containerized environment like OpenShift can bring you better security than you could get in a virtual machine world. And so the argument for modernizing applications in that way has a security component too. We're gonna talk all about that.
Well, I think we should definitely talk about what are we calling sandbox containers
Yep.
at some point, and what that means and how that affects. So sandbox containers are why is the name of the technology escaping me? Where it's running, it's using virtualization to run an isolated kernel for that container, but it's not
Right.
a full virtual machine. And where all of that fits in. So definitely interested on that. We can talk about that next week because we're coming up on time.
Cool.
Fiaz, how do I track pod running some critical command like OC debug node command? Is it possible to do it without ACS by some manual means? I think if you have audit logging enabled, it will generate an event for that, and you can trigger the alerting to send something out. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything additional.
No, I think that's the way to do it, though. With RBAC to control it and audit logging to understand the use of that. So you'll be able to see those events in there if you want to pull them out. I mean, it requires parsing the audit logs, but that information is recorded there. And, the ability to run that is controlled through RBAC as well.
Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head, Chris or Jonny, maybe you know this. If I debug into a node, right, OC debug to a node, and I'm running CLI commands, are those logged anywhere? With RHEL 8, I think we introduced the ability to do replay, or maybe it was RHEL 9, where when you log in, it basically records the commands, the sessions that you're using, and I can go back later and audit them and see exactly, Jonny SSH into the system, and here's exactly what he was doing. I don't know if that same thing exists in OpenShift.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe on the OCP 9 nodes, but I think as it is on like 4.12, 4.13, I think you just go in and like whatever your regular auditing would pick up,
Interesting. It's more questions to ask and find out answers to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's all I have today. Chris, I will let you close. Say any closing remarks, and Jonny, I'll leave you with last words. So, thank you so much for coming on today, Chris. This has been just incredibly informational for me. Super dense. I'm going to have to re-listen to this one. So I appreciate it, and I always learn things whenever I chat with you. So, thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me. That's all I have to say. See you next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have much to say either. You guys killed it. Chris, you're awesome. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to continuing this on next week. So have a good week.
Thanks, guys.